Welcome to the mysteries of marriage. My husband abandoned me at the airport and drove off alone. A week later, he asked his assistant, "Has my wife returned yet?" The assistant, panicking, replied, "She can't be reached." He instantly collapsed. Married for 3 years. Everyone said that I, a quiet wallflower, had won the lottery. My husband, Julian Vance, was a rising star in the corporate world, and I, Claire Sterling, was just an ordinary interior designer. I had carefully and cautiously built our marriage until that rainy night. At the airport, because of a single phone call from his first love, he left me and my suitcase at the departure curb and drove away without looking back. The cold rain soaked my clothes to the bone and woke me from a 3-year naive dream. During that week, I wiped away all my tears and made a decision no one expected. A week later, when Julian finally broke free from the whirlwind of his work and the tenderness of his first love, he asked the housekeeper in a hoarse voice, "Martha, why isn't Claire home yet?" In response, he heard only the panicked voice of the older woman, "Mr. Vance, your wife hasn't been reachable since that very evening." At that moment, Julian suddenly realized that the woman who had always quietly waited for him right where he left her had vanished. On the day I was abandoned at the airport, we were supposed to be celebrating our 3rd wedding anniversary. Half a month prior, I had booked flights and a luxury resort in Maui, wanting to surprise him. For the last 6 months, he had been too busy. So busy that he often slept at the office, coming home only to crash into bed. I thought a trip just for the two of us would help bring back the warmth we had at the beginning of our marriage. In the VIP lounge at JFK Airport, full of hope, I sent him one last text. "Julian, I'm already at the airport. Waiting for you at gate 12. Don't be late for the flight." I attached a photo of my boarding pass. The message vanished into the void. 2 hours before the flight, he still hadn't shown up. He didn't answer his phone. I started to worry, but I kept making excuses for him. The board meeting probably ran late. Traffic on the Van Wyck must be a nightmare. An hour before the flight, I couldn't sit still anymore. Grabbing my suitcase, I ran out to the departure curb and anxiously scanned the stream of cars. Finally, his black Maybach appeared. I breathed a sigh of relief and waved. The car pulled up exactly in front of me. The passenger window rolled down, and I saw Julian's sharp profile. He was in a perfectly pressed black dress shirt without a tie, his eyes holding their usual detachment and a faint hint of irritation. "Julian." I reached for the door handle to open it and put my suitcase in. "Wait." His voice was cold. He wasn't even looking at me. His gaze was glued to the phone screen on the center console. The phone rang insistently. He glanced at the caller ID, and his expression instantly changed. A softness and anxious care appeared, something I so rarely saw. It was Penelope. Penelope Sinclair. His first love, the one who had moved to Europe chasing her dream of becoming a prima ballerina, the one he couldn't forget all these years. He answered immediately, and his voice became so gentle, a tone I had never heard directed at me. "Penny, what happened? Speak slowly, don't cry." From the other end came muffled sobs and broken phrases. I faintly heard, "Tore a ligament. It hurts so much. I'm alone. I'm scared." Julian's brows drew together, and his voice softened even more. "Don't be afraid, I'm coming right now. Drop me your location, stay put, and wait for me." Ending the call, he finally looked at me, or rather, at my hand holding the car door. That brief tenderness in his eyes quickly hardened, replaced by his usual businesslike coldness. "Claire, take a cab home, or change the ticket, cancel the trip, whatever you want." He spoke quickly, in a commanding tone that brokered no argument. I froze. My fingertips went numb. "Julian, what about our flight?" Penny was rehearsing at a studio upstate. She aggravated an old ankle injury, and there's no one around. He interrupted me with a hint of impatience, as if my questions were an inappropriate whim. "I have to go to her immediately, but today is the words stuck in my throat. Anniversaries happen every year." He looked at his watch, a gesture full of impatience. "Penny has an emergency. You always understand everything. Figure it out yourself." The word understand pierced my heart like 2 needles. In 3 years of marriage, the thing I had learned to do best was exactly that. Understand that I couldn't distract him from work. Understand that I had to handle all the household chores myself. Understand that I needed to disappear when he needed silence. Understand that I could never ask about Penelope Sinclair. But in exchange for my understanding, on the eve of our anniversary, my husband abandoned me in an impending downpour at the airport because of one phone call from his ex-girlfriend. Julian, my voice trembled, whether from the cold or something else. What if I say that today? I want you to come with me. He seemed genuinely surprised that I could be so ununderstanding and abject. He froze for a moment, and then his gaze completely iced over. There was no anger, only complete indifference and alienation. Claire, don't make a scene. He reached out and gently but firmly removed my fingers from the car door. Go home. I'll have Preston contact you. Saying that, he didn't even glance at me, rolled up the window, and the engine roared. The black car merged into traffic without the slightest hesitation and quickly vanished. Almost the exact moment the car disappeared from sight, the sky opened up. Heavy raindrops battered my face and my suitcase. The freezing water instantly soaked my trench coat and dress. Cars honked, people shouted, and garbled airport announcements echoed around me. Everyone was rushing toward their destinations or to those waiting for them. Only I stood alone on the edge of the curb, like forgotten luggage. The rain streamed down my hair, getting into my eyes, hot and bitter. I raised my hand to wipe my face, but touched only ice-cold skin. At that moment, a string in my soul pulled tight by 3 years of waiting finally snapped with a resounding crack. It turned out that all my efforts, all my waiting, weren't worth a single tearful phone call from Penelope. He wasn't too busy. He just didn't want to spend time on me. He wasn't naturally cold. He was just saving all his warmth for someone else. And I, Claire Sterling, in the script of Julian Vance's life, was probably just a temporary understudy, a supporting actress who could be written off the stage at any moment. Now that the leading lady had returned, it was time for me to exit. The rain intensified. I stood motionless, letting the water wash everything away. Strangely, after the initial sharp pain, a feeling of emptiness and peace washed over me, bringing a cruel, sharp clarity. I slowly bent down and grabbed the wet handle of my suitcase. The wheels rolled over the wet asphalt. I didn't take a cab home. I didn't want to take a single step back into that luxurious penthouse, full of Julian's traces but utterly devoid of warmth. I dragged my suitcase back into the bright airport terminal. My soaked clothes clung to my body. I was freezing, but my steps became firmer. I walked to the ticket counter and, using the last of the money I had earned from freelance design projects, bought a ticket on the next flight to a small mountain town in North Carolina, famous for its arts district and slow-paced lifestyle. It wasn't a luxury resort in Maui, but a place Julian would never think of and would never go looking for me. Before boarding, I took out my phone, deleted Julian's number from my contacts, and blocked him on every app. Then I turned off the phone, took out the SIM card, and dropped it into a trash can in the waiting area. Goodbye, Julian. Goodbye to my humiliating, ridiculous 3-year marriage. The plane soared into the night sky, piercing the heavy rain clouds. Outside the window was a serene, starry night, and amidst the chaos, my new life was quietly beginning. Julian found Penelope in the rehearsal studio. She was sitting on the floor, an ice pack pressed to her ankle, her eyes red from crying. Julian, seeing him, Penelope started crying again, displaying all her artistic fragility and dependence. I'm sorry for bothering you so late. It just hurt so much, and I was all alone. Don't be silly. Julian quickly walked over and crouched down to examine her ankle. His movements were practiced and natural. It seemed such scenes had happened often in their youth. He frowned. It's swelling badly. We need to get you to a doctor. Can you walk? Penelope bit her lip, shook her head, and reached out her arms. The meaning was clear. Julian picked her up without hesitation. Penelope immediately pressed her face into his shoulder, inhaling the familiar, crisp scent of his cologne, the corners of her lips curving into a hidden smile. On the way to the clinic, Penelope spoke in a soft voice about the hardships of studying abroad, her dedication to ballet, and how much she missed him. Julian, all these years I thought about our past so often. It was so good back then. Julian, focused on driving, only offered a brief hum in response. His eyes flicked to the center console. The phone screen was dark. No new messages, no missed calls. Claire must have gone home by now, he thought. She had always been so quiet and obedient, never causing problems. With that thought, the slight unease he felt about abandoning her evaporated. After Penelope was treated and he took her to her rented apartment, it was late into the night. Penelope held onto his sleeve, her eyes shining. "Julian, it's so late. Are you going home? Maybe you could stay here, on the couch? I'm a little scared to be alone." Julian looked at the dark night outside the window, then at her bandaged foot, and finally nodded. "All right, rest. I'll be in the living room." He sat on the couch, but sleep wouldn't come. His phone screen lit up. Preston had sent tomorrow's schedule. He suddenly remembered that tomorrow was a special day of some sort. His memory was foggy. Doesn't matter, he decided. He opened his messages. The chat with Claire was frozen on the picture of the boarding pass. His finger hovered over the screen, but ultimately, he typed nothing. "It's late. She must be asleep. I'll talk to her tomorrow." For the next few days, Julian was incredibly busy. The integration of a newly acquired tech firm was proving difficult, and he practically lived at the office. Penelope needed to go in for checkups, and he had Preston arrange a driver for her, only occasionally asking about her condition. He completely forgot about his wedding anniversary and the wife he had left at the airport. Claire didn't text or call. The house was surprisingly quiet. At first, Julian considered this normal, even felt a bit relieved. Claire was always quiet and never interfered with his work. Maybe she's offended. She'll get over it in a couple of days, he thought. He remembered how last year he had missed her birthday because of an international conference. She had given him the silent treatment for 2 days, and then went right back to making him breakfast and ironing his shirts. It's probably the same this time. It's just a matter of time. When I finish this deal, maybe I'll take her to a nice restaurant, Julian reasoned, and pushed it out of his mind. 7 days passed. Finally, the major contract was signed, and Julian was able to leave the office by 8:00 p.m. The exhaustion of the past few days made him crave a hot shower and his own bed. When the car pulled into the private garage of his penthouse, he belatedly realized that the house was somehow too quiet. The warm lights in the living room weren't on, there were no sounds from the kitchen, and there was no figure waiting to greet him with the soft question, "Did you eat?" He frowned, punched in the security code, and opened the door. Only the motion sensor lights in the foyer came on. The cold white light illuminated the empty shoe rack. His slippers sat neatly in their place. Next to them were Claire's beige plush slippers. Nothing seemed to have changed, but something was wrong. "Where is Claire?" he asked as he loosened his tie, spotting the housekeeper, Martha. Surprise and worry flickered across the older woman's face. She wrung her hands. "Mr. Vance, didn't she go on vacation with you?" "She left with her suitcase that evening." Julian froze. His memory violently dragged him back to that rainy night at the airport. Yes, they were supposed to fly out for vacation, and he had left her. So did she fly out alone, or not? A faint, almost unfamiliar feeling began to creep into his chest. He took out his phone, found Claire's number, and dialed. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable or powered off," the mechanical voice stated. Julian frowned deeper. Powered off. Dead battery. He opened his messaging app, found her profile picture, a photo of a potted jasmine plant she had been tending to for a long time. The last time he had texted her was half a month ago, briefly stating he wouldn't be home for dinner. He typed, "Where are you?" The message was sent, but almost instantly, a red exclamation mark appeared with small text underneath. Message failed to deliver. You have been blocked by this user. Blocked. Julian stared at that line of text for several seconds. Claire had blocked him. This realization caused the strange feeling inside him to swell into an inexplicable irritation. She dared to block him just because he hadn't gone with her when she was being so ununderstanding and petty? Martha. His voice grew hollow. A tension crept into it that he himself didn't notice. Has she really not been back all these days? The panic on the housekeeper's face became more pronounced. She shook her head. No, Mr. Vance. I haven't seen her since the evening you two left. I thought you were having a good time and decided to stay longer. Julian's heart dropped heavily. Not back. For 7 whole days. Did she contact you? Tell you when she'd be back? No, Mr. Vance. Martha's voice began to tremble. For the first couple of days, I thought it was normal. Then I wanted to ask if she needed anything prepared, but her phone was always off. I texted her too, no response. I was scared something had happened to her, but I didn't dare bother you at work. Julian stood rooted to the spot. His loosened tie hung around his neck. The light from the phone screen reflected on his suddenly pale face. The main lights in the living room were off. Only the sensors cast pale beams, stretching his shadow across the cold marble floor. The air felt stagnant. 7 days. Phone off. Blocked. Missing. These words spun in his head, colliding and merging into a single possibility he had never considered. Claire hadn't just gotten offended. She hadn't just started giving him the silent treatment. She had cut all ties and silently vanished from his world. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving a ringing in his ears. The irritation was replaced by a massive, unfamiliar feeling. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and a chilling sensation he didn't want to admit even to himself. Panic. Did she leave a note? Or take any of her things? He heard his own dry, raspy voice. Martha, frightened by his appearance, hastily replied, I'll go check her room and study right now. Julian didn't move. He stood still, slowly looking around the space he called home, but which he had never truly examined. Huge, luxurious, clean, and cold. Empty, without the slightest sign of life. When Claire was here, it seemed exactly the same. She had always quietly and neatly arranged everything, like a soft background. Her presence was taken for granted, so much so that he hardly noticed it. Only now, when that background was abruptly ripped away, did he see the gaping void. Martha ran down the stairs, holding a light blue envelope in her hands. Her voice shook. Mr. Vance, I found this on her vanity, under her jewelry box. Julian snatched the envelope. It was light. On it, in Claire's neat handwriting, was just one word. Julian. His fingers went numb. He quickly ripped it open. There was no letter inside, only 2 thin, neatly folded pieces of paper. One was a petition for divorce, signed by her. The words Claire Elizabeth Sterling were written so firmly they almost pressed through the paper. The second was a debit card. Stuck to the back was a small sticky note with the same handwriting. The remaining balance of the household allowance for the past 3 years. I'm returning it all. As of this moment, we are even. Live and be happy. We are even. Live and be happy. Julian gripped the 2 light pieces of paper with ice-cold fingers. Dead silence hung in the living room, broken only by his accelerated breathing and the wind howling outside the window. At that moment, his phone rang. The name Penelope flashed on the screen. In any other situation, he would have answered immediately. But right now, the cheerful ringtone in the empty, silent penthouse sounded deafening and almost grotesque. He didn't answer. He just lifted his head and looked out into the dark night. A lump sat in his throat, preventing him from making a sound. It turned out that the little bird who had always sat quietly on her perch, whom he considered his property, hadn't forgotten how to fly. She had simply folded her wings. And now, she had flown away. Flown into a sky where he would never find her, and where he could no longer reach her. Julian ignored Penelope's call. He stood in the middle of the cold, empty living room, clutching the divorce papers and the debit card. It seemed he was truly seeing the place he called home for the first time. Without Claire's presence, this luxurious space felt like a perfectly staged hotel room. No warmth, no life, no one waiting for him. Martha stood nearby, afraid to speak. After a long time, Julian finally seemed to find his voice. He rasped, Martha, carefully check all the belongings in Claire's room. Make me a list of what she took. And also, he paused. His eyes fell on the card in his hand. Check the transaction history on this card. Let's see exactly how much money she returned. Yes, Mr. Vance. Martha answered quickly and hurried upstairs. Julian walked over to the wet bar and poured himself a glass of bourbon. The ice-cold liquid burned his throat but failed to soothe the growing anxiety and emptiness in his chest. He picked up his phone again, ignoring another missed call and texts from Penelope, and dialed his assistant. Mr. Vance. Preston answered immediately. Julian's voice was strained, though he didn't notice it. Preston, use every resource we have and find Claire Sterling. Start with the security footage at JFK from that night. Check every flight, train, hotel, booking, anything that requires her ID. I want to know where she is within 24 hours. Preston, on the other end, was clearly stunned. In all his years working for Vance, he had never heard him issue a command with such an urgent, almost unhinged tone and, for his wife, no less. Yes, sir. Getting on it immediately. The next 24 hours became a strange ordeal for Julian. He canceled all non-urgent meetings and sat in his office, staring at his computer screen as his assistant sent in fragments of information. For the first time, he focused all his attention on 3 words. Claire Elizabeth Sterling. The pieces began to form a picture. She had bought a ticket on a red-eye flight to a small mountain city in North Carolina, Asheville, known for its arts district and pottery. She paid for the ticket and all subsequent expenses using a personal bank account he had never seen. She checked in under the name Claire Sterling at a bed and breakfast called the Quiet Haven and had lived there for the past 7 days. The B&B owner mentioned that the girl, Claire, was very quiet, left early in the morning, returned late at night, and seemed to spend all her time walking around the arts district or at an old local pottery studio. Mr. Vance, Preston reported over the phone, sounding slightly hesitant. There's something else. A week before she left, your wife transferred all the money from her freelance design account, about $50,000 in 3 transactions, to her personal, rarely used card. And yesterday, a $15,000 transfer was made from that card to the account of Hayes Pottery Studio. The payment memo said, Master Ceramics Course and Materials. Ceramics. $15,000. Julian unconsciously drummed his fingers on the desk. He knew Claire had studied design, but her liking pottery was news to him. He vaguely recalled her mentioning a couple of times that she wanted to take a class, but he had either been too busy or replied dismissively, "If you like it, sign up," without giving it a second thought. So this wasn't an impulsive escape. It was a planned departure. She had even funded her new life with her own money to learn a craft he knew nothing about and probably would never have approved of. This realization caused him a dull ache, stronger than simply her leaving. He realized he didn't know the woman he had lived with for 3 years at all. Her hobbies, her dreams, her savings, all her thoughts hidden behind her silence. He knew nothing. Book me a ticket on the next flight to Asheville. Julian closed his laptop and stood up. He had to see her immediately. Mr. Vance, tomorrow morning are the final negotiations with Omnitech. Reschedule it, he interrupted in a tone that allowed no argument. A flight, then a rental car. By the time Julian, covered in travel fatigue, stood at the gate of the Quiet Haven bed and breakfast, it was already evening. The historic town was bathed in the golden rays of the setting sun. Brick sidewalks, mountain streams, it seemed. Time moved slower here. Betty, the welcoming, middle-aged owner, paused when she saw Julian's tailored suit and intense demeanor. Are you looking for someone, Han? I'm looking for Claire Sterling. She's staying here. Julian tried to speak calmly. Ah, Claire. Betty smiled, though a bit confused. She's usually at Arthur's pottery studio during the day. She only comes back in the evening. But, mister, who are you to her? I'm her husband. When Julian said those 2 words, his heart gave an unpleasant lurch. Betty gave him an assessing look and pointed down the road. Hayes' studio is down by the river, about a 10-minute walk, though it seems Claire is quite happy here. Thank you. Julian didn't wait to hear more and set off at a fast pace in the direction she pointed. The closer he got to the studio, the more distinct the earthy smell of wet clay became. It was an old brick building with a small courtyard. The gate was open, and the quiet hum of a spinning pottery wheel and soft acoustic music drifted out. Julian stopped at the gate. In the courtyard, under an old oak tree with her back to him, sat Claire at a pottery wheel. She wore a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was messily tied up, a few strands falling against her neck. The golden sunset filtered through the leaves, casting a soft, glowing halo around her. She leaned forward slightly, her hands confidently gripping a spinning mound of clay. Her expression was focused and serene. Julian had never seen that expression on her face. Not the timid look she wore around him, nor the quiet, sad look she had when she was alone. This was pure immersion, the calm and satisfaction of creation, radiating a soft light. The clay in her hands seemed to come alive, rising and thinning with every rotation of the wheel, taking on elegant curves. Her fingers were coated in mud, but her movements were confident, strong, and full of inexplicable harmony. Julian just stood and watched. The anxiety, the questions, and even the hidden anger he had brought with him seemed to dissolve into this peaceful scene and the smell of clay dust. In their place came a massive, unfamiliar sense of disorientation, and even a fear of disturbing this peace. In his memory, Claire was always in elegant dresses, with perfect makeup, quietly arranging flowers, reading a book, or cooking dinner for him. She was like a beautifully crafted painting, pretty, but devoid of life. But this woman, sitting amidst the earth and sun, with her hands in the mud, with such a focused face as if she held the world's greatest treasure, was terrifyingly unfamiliar to him, yet she radiated an astonishing, vibrant life force. It turned out that, stripped of her role as Julian Vance's wife, this was who she was. Claire. He finally spoke. His voice was hoarse from long silence and tension. The pottery wheel slowly stopped. Claire's back tensed almost imperceptibly. She didn't turn around immediately. She slowly lifted the formed piece off the wheel, carefully set it on a wooden shelf, then grabbed a damp towel and thoroughly wiped her hands. Every movement was unhurried, calm. Then she turned around. The sunset illuminated her face. She wore no makeup. Her skin had caught a slight tan. Her eyes were clear and calm. When she looked at him, there was no anger, no resentment, no tears, none of what he had expected to see. Just a deep, pool-like calm and a mild, understanding detachment. "You're here," she said. Her tone was so even it was as if she were commenting on the weather. All of Julian's prepared words, the questions, the explanations, even the authoritative "we're going home" stuck in his throat. Under her calm gaze, they seemed pale, powerless, and even ridiculous. He opened his mouth, but out of 1,000 words, he could only squeeze out a dry. "Your phone was off." "Yes." Claire nodded, picked up a glass of water from the table, and took a sip. "I changed my number and stopped using those apps. I wanted to live in peace." Her calmness was like a soft but impenetrable wall, repelling all his emotions and words. Julian felt a powerlessness he had never known before. He took a step forward, trying to close the distance. "Claire, that night at the airport." "It's me." "Julian." Claire interrupted him quietly. Her voice was still peaceful, but it carried an undeniable firmness. "What happened, happened. The divorce papers? You must have seen them. Let's find time and make it official. I don't want your money or property. Let's just consider these 3 years a dream." A dream. These light words slowly carved into Julian's heart like a dull knife. He suddenly realized that in 3 years of marriage, he had never heard her say his name so clearly, coldly, and with such resolve. It wasn't a dream. He abruptly raised his voice, not noticing his own urgency. "Claire, I know I was wrong that day. I shouldn't have left you, but Penny, she had an emergency. She's alone in the city, and with her injury, I don't need explanations regarding Miss Sinclair," Claire interrupted again. A faint, almost ghostly smile touched her lips. "That is your business with her. It has nothing to do with me." "How does it have nothing to do with you? You are my wife." Julian's self-control began to tear at the seams. He stepped forward, trying to grab her wrist, but with a fluid movement, she dodged him. The hand that used to gently straighten his collar and serve him hot coffee, now bearing the remnants of cold clay, avoided him like a snake. Claire looked up and met his eyes calmly. The eyes that had once been full of tender expectation now reflected only a clear understanding and a slight weariness. "Julian," she said slowly, enunciating every word. "From the moment you abandoned me in the rain at the airport without hesitation because another woman called, from the moment you went 7 whole days without checking on me or even remembering what day it was, from that moment, my status as your wife ceased to exist. That's not true. I was incredibly busy those days. So busy that you couldn't find the time for a single text or call?" Claire asked quietly. The voice was low but like a fine needle. It precisely punctured all his self-deceiving excuses. "Admit it, Julian. You weren't too busy. You just didn't care. You didn't care if I got soaked in the rain, didn't care if I was hurt, didn't care where I went, or even if I still existed in your world." She paused. Her gaze swept over his expensive but slightly travel-wrinkled suit, noting the undeniable anxiety and confusion in his eyes. A deep exhaustion sounded in her voice. "I'm so tired of these 3 years. I was always waiting for you to turn around, to see me, to give me just a little attention and care. I was like a beggar holding out my heart on the road you walked on. But you couldn't even spare the time to look down. No, Julian. I don't want to wait anymore, and I don't need to. Claire's voice suddenly became incredibly light, as if she had dropped a massive weight from her shoulders. Look at me. Without you, without the title of Julian Vance's wife, I am living very well. For the first time, I realize how good the clay smells in the sun, that my hands can do more than iron your shirts, they can create warm, beautiful things. That living a day in silence, for myself, is peaceful and joyful. She walked to the gate and looked out at the slow-moving river and the smoke rising from a chimney on the opposite bank. Her profile in the sunset light seemed soft but resolute. Go back, Julian. Go back to your corporate empire, to the world where you need to control everything. That's your battlefield. But here. She turned and looked at him. Her gaze was serene, but it felt like it crossed a distance of 1,000 miles. Here is my peace. We were always from different worlds. I was foolish before, trying to squeeze into yours. Now I understand. And I've stepped out. Let's let each other go. All right. Julian froze, staring at her figure framed by the gold of the sunset, at her eyes filled with a peace and vastness he could never, and would never, reach. He suddenly realized clearly that he hadn't lost her temporarily, not just over a fight. He had lost her forever, permanently. The Claire who had once looked at him with her whole heart. An invisible hand seemed to squeeze his chest. A dull ache made it hard to breathe. He opened his mouth, but the lump in his throat prevented him from speaking. The sun dipped behind the distant mountains. The last golden ray slipped off Claire. She turned, picked up the freshly made clay vase from the shelf, still holding the warmth of her fingers, and called out into the depths of the studio. Arthur, I'm heading out. I'll come finish this tomorrow. From inside came a warm, older voice. All right, Claire. Walk safe. Claire gave Julian a slight nod. It was a final farewell. Then, cradling her vase, she walked out of the courtyard with steady steps, heading down the brick path toward the B&B. She never looked back. Julian stood for a long time in the gathering dusk, watching her silhouette dissolve into the warm lights and the flow of people in the historic town until she completely disappeared. The evening breeze brought the scent of river water and the aroma of dinner from nearby houses. It was an ordinary smell, but full of life. It was so different from his usual cold, air-conditioned offices and expensive colognes. He suddenly remembered how, a long time ago, Claire had timidly asked him, Julian, why don't we go to a quiet little town sometime? Just live there for a few days. Just the two of us. What had he answered then? He thought he was reading some report and, without looking up, irritably snapped, What's there to do? It's a waste of time. Yes, a waste of time. So he left her alone in what he considered a waste of time alone for 3 whole years, until she finally accumulated enough disappointment to decide to erase his world, and him along with it, from her time entirely. Julian slowly crouched down and picked up a small, dried lump of clay from the ground that Claire had accidentally dropped. The rough surface burned his palm. It turned out this was what it felt like to have your heart ripped out. Claire walked along the brick path toward the B&B, clutching the damp vase to her chest. Dusk was falling, and the street lamps along the riverbanks flickered on one by one, reflecting in the water and scattering into thousands of trembling lights. Her steps were confident, and her heartbeat had long since calmed. The tension and feigned composure she had felt upon seeing Julian washed away the moment she was out of his sight, leaving behind only deep exhaustion and an even firmer resolve. She wasn't surprised Julian had found her. With his resources, it was only a matter of time. She just didn't expect it to happen so fast. It seemed the divorce papers and the returned debit card had bruised his arrogant ego after all. Perhaps it wasn't about feelings, but about his property slipping out of his control. Returning to the quiet haven, she saw Betty tending to the garden. Seeing Claire, the older woman approached with concern. Claire, honey, was that man really your husband? Claire smiled, not denying it. He was. Soon, he won't be. Betty, an experienced woman, saw the calm in her eyes and the absence of bitterness, and understood. She didn't ask further questions, just patted her arm. The important thing is you're back. I've got some chamomile tea with honey brewing on the stove. Calms the nerves. Let me pour you a cup. I saw you working all day, you hardly ate. A wave of warmth passed through Claire's heart. She nodded and sincerely thanked her. Thank you, Betty. This simple, natural kindness from strangers was something she had rarely felt in that cold, luxurious penthouse. Martha was kind, but their relationship was strictly professional. Here, the boundaries between people were blurred and warmed, like this hot tea that soothed her stomach and her soul. She sat on a wicker chair on the porch, taking small sips of the sweet, fragrant tea. The night sky was clear, with a few stars visible. The breeze carried the scent of fried potatoes from a neighbor's house and quiet laughter. This was life real, a bit rough around the edges, but full of warmth. Not the vacuum dome where she had to constantly be the elegant, quiet, proper wife of Julian Vance. After finishing the tea, she returned to her room. It was small but cozy, with a window looking out over the creek. She carefully placed the new vase on the wooden table by the window and examined it under the lamp. The shape wasn't perfect yet, but it was her first decent piece made entirely on her own. Arthur had said it had soul. Soul. Claire stroked the rough surface of the vase and remembered Julian appearing at the gate earlier. Her initial shock, followed immediately by relief. What was going to happen, happened. It was good that now it would all be over. She didn't turn on the main light, just sat in the quiet moonlight and the glow of the street lamps. Julian's appearance was like a stone thrown into a calm lake. Ripples formed, but there was no storm at the bottom. In these short 7 days spent among clay and sweat, trial and error, she felt she had kneaded all her resentments, bitterness, and disappointments from the past 3 years into the clay. And with every rotation of the wheel, with every shaping and sanding, she had transformed them into a quiet strength. She realized she was truly over it. Meanwhile, Julian sat in the town's only decent hotel, awake all night. The accommodations were far from his usual presidential suites, but sleep evaded him entirely. His mind kept replaying the scene at the pottery studio. Claire's calm gaze, her detached tone, and that phrase, "Let's let each other go." He never thought the words "let go" would come from Claire directed at him. He always controlled everything. He decided when things started, set the pace, and he thought he would decide when things ended. But she had decisively walked away, taking the power of choice into her own hands. Preston had sent more detailed information, including Claire's routine over the last week. Up at 7:00 a.m., a walk by the river. At 8:00 a.m., classes at Arthur's studio. For lunch, a bowl of homemade chili and cornbread at a small local diner around the corner. Afternoon, more classes or solo practice. Evening, return to the B&B. Sometimes, she went to the local community center for a bluegrass music session. Measured, calm, fulfilling. The report included a few photos taken from a distance. In one, she sat on the stone steps by the river, thoughtfully looking at the water. In another, she was walking out of the studio, clutching something to her chest, a bright smile on her face. The sun played in her hair. Julian stared at that photo for a long time. He suddenly realized he couldn't remember the last time Claire had smiled so easily, naturally, and genuinely around him. It seemed so long ago that the memory had faded. He automatically opened the rarely used family album on his phone. It was mostly photos from the beginning of their marriage, taken at her parents' insistence, and a few shots from corporate galas where she accompanied him. In every photo, she wore perfect makeup, elegant clothes, and held onto his arm with a standard smile and empty eyes. Even through the lens, her timidity was obvious. Not a single photo was like the one in the report alive, real, smelling of the earth. The dull ache in his chest returned, sharper and clearer than during the day. He turned off the phone and walked to the window. The mountain town was quiet. He could only hear the rushing water and the occasional bark of a dog. It was so different from the eternal noise and neon lights of the city. Claire had said her peace was here. What was in his world? Besides endless meetings, negotiations, galas, and a house that was always waiting but ignored by him. What else? Penelope's name flashed on the screen again. He declined the call and typed a message. Focus on healing your injury. I am incredibly busy for the foreseeable future. Do not disturb me. Then he put the phone on silent. He needed to think everything over. No. Not think, admit. Admit his arrogance over the past 3 years. admit that he had lost someone, and admit this unprecedented, unfamiliar emptiness in his soul. The next morning, right at dawn, Julian left the hotel. He didn't call for a car, but walked from memory toward the pottery studio. He didn't go inside. He just found an inconspicuous spot across the river and watched from a distance. Claire arrived on time, the same simple linen clothes, face without makeup, carrying a canvas tote. She smiled and greeted a neighbor returning from the farmer's market, then walked into the courtyard. Soon, the familiar hum of the wheel and the quiet voices of her and Arthur drifted out. He couldn't hear the words, but the atmosphere was light and relaxed. Julian stood there for a long time, like a trespasser peeking into someone else's happiness. He watched Claire intently knead the clay, listened carefully to the old master's instructions, how her eyes lit up at a successful stage, and how she crinkled her nose at a failure, stubbornly starting over. These rich, vibrant emotions were a treasure he had never seen in their 3 years of marriage. Around lunchtime, Claire washed her hands, said goodbye to the master, and walked out. She didn't go home but confidently turned down an alley toward that local diner. Julian hesitated, then followed her. The diner was small, only 4 or 5 tables occupied by locals and a few tourists. It was noisy, crowded, and smelled of home cooking. Claire seemed to know the owner. She smiled and said, "The usual, please." She sat at a corner table, poured herself some sweet tea, and waited calmly. Julian stood by the entrance, watching her sit there so effortlessly, fitting perfectly into this bustling environment. She was no longer Julian Vance's wife, who needed to dine at Michelin-starred restaurants and mind her etiquette. She was just an ordinary person who was hungry and came in for a bowl of chili. But her back was straight, her gaze clear, and she looked freer and more confident than ever. There was a groundedness to her. His feet felt rooted to the ground. He suddenly lacked the courage to walk in and disrupt this peaceful, life-filled sanctuary of hers. The owner brought her a large, steaming bowl of chili with a slice of cornbread, saying something with a smile. Claire smiled back, nodded, picked up her spoon, and ate with obvious enjoyment. Julian suddenly realized that in 3 years of marriage, he had never once asked her what her favorite food was. The meals at home were always prepared according to his tastes and his nutritionist's recommendations. She had never seemed picky and never asked for anything. Now he knew. She loved simple, hearty food like this. He silently turned and walked away from the noisy alley. He walked along the river. The sun blinded his eyes. For the first time, he clearly realized that what stood between him and Claire wasn't just Penelope, not just abandoning her at the airport, and not just 7 days of indifference. What stood between them was his arrogance, his cold apathy, his refusal to even try to understand her world. And now, he was paying the ultimate bitter price for that arrogance. Claire knew Julian hadn't left. Men like him, once they made a decision, didn't retreat. Their conversation at the studio wasn't a final period. It was his first failed attempt. He needed time to reassess the situation and develop a new strategy. She knew him too well. Julian Vance, accustomed to winning in business, wouldn't allow anything or anyone to slip out of his control, including his marriage, or rather, his property. But this time, she was no longer the property waiting for his decision. She stopped caring whether he was in town or where he was staying. She poured all her time and energy into learning ceramics. Throwing on the wheel was the foundation and the hardest part. The pressure, the moisture, the feel of the material, the focus, the slightest deviation, and the piece collapsed. She experienced countless failures. Calluses formed on her hands, cracking and turning into rough skin. But she didn't think of quitting. Clay is honest. The effort you put in is exactly what you get out. It was so much simpler and easier to understand than human relationships. Arthur was a master craftsman, one of the best in the state. He was a man of few words, but his advice was precise. He saw that Claire had a steady hand and the right mindset, and he taught her with all his heart. From wedging the clay to throwing, trimming, and firing step by step, Claire immersed herself in the process, as if she had returned to her college days, pulling all-nighters in the design studio. Pure, focused creation, full of the joy of making something real. Julian, as expected, didn't try to bother her again, but he hadn't left Asheville either. He rented a room at a more secluded lodge nearby. During the day, he seemed to be working remotely. His laptop was always with him, his conference calls endless. But every time Claire walked to the studio, to the diner, or strolled by the river in the evening, he would be somewhere nearby. He didn't speak, didn't approach. He just watched. At first, Claire felt uncomfortable, but then she accepted it. He watched, that was his business. She lived, that was hers. She even began to ignore his presence, treating him like an unusual rock on the riverbank. Her world slowly filled with new shapes of pottery, rare praise from Arthur, hot tea from Betty, and extra cornbread from the diner owner. It became concrete and warm. A week passed this way, until an uninvited guest shattered the fragile balance. That day, Claire had just finished a rather successful vase and was carefully setting it on the shelf to dry. From the courtyard came the sharp clatter of heels and a whiny, petulant female voice. "Julian, you're staying in a place like this? I barely found you." Claire's hand twitched slightly. She had only heard that voice once, over the phone on that rainy night. Then, it had been muffled by tears. Now, it was clear and grating. She turned and saw Penelope Sinclair, wearing an elegant designer dress utterly out of place in the rustic mountain town. Teetering on stilettos, she walked into the courtyard, her face full of grievance and dissatisfaction. Julian was a few steps behind her, frowning, looking profoundly displeased. Penelope's gaze swept the courtyard and landed on Claire, on her clay-stained apron and hands. Disbelief flashed in her eyes, followed by undisguised contempt and a sudden, feigned understanding. "Claire." Penelope lifted her chin. Her tone was condescendingly inquisitive. "Is that really you? I thought Julian had made a mistake. What are you doing here?" She pointed at the tools and raw clay as if it were something shameful. Claire set down her tool, untied her apron, and calmly wiped her hands. She looked at Penelope, and then at Julian standing behind her, her expression unreadable. "So, the leading lady has personally arrived on the battlefield. Miss Sinclair, did you need something?" Claire's tone was flat, devoid of emotion. Penelope seemed taken aback by her calmness. Then she stepped forward, trying to make her voice sound sincere and guilty. "Claire, I came specifically to see you. About that night at the airport. I am so sorry. My old injury flared up. It hurt terribly, and I've been alone for so long. I got scared and couldn't help but call Julian. I never imagined it would cause such a huge misunderstanding between you two, or that you'd run away from home because of me. I came to personally apologize and beg you to forgive me, to come back to Julian and live like before. After all, you are husband and wife. What a heartfelt, noble speech." She painted herself in the best light, blaming everything on a misunderstanding and Claire's childish running away. Claire listened calmly, even nodding when she finished. Then she turned to the silent Julian and asked, "Mr. Vance, was it your idea to bring Miss Sinclair here to convince me to come back and live like before?" Julian's frown deepened. He looked at Penelope with obvious disapproval and intense irritation. "Penny, enough. This is none of your business. Go back to New York. Julian, I just don't want you to have problems because of me." Penelope's eyes reddened. Tears pooled in her voice. "Claire, you can scold me, blame me, whatever you want, but Julian has been so worried about you. He hasn't eaten, hasn't slept. He dropped his work just to find you. Please, for the sake of your 3 years together, stop throwing a tantrum." "I apologize. I'll leave. I will never bother you again." And the tears actually began to roll down her cheeks. In the past, seeing a scene like this, Penelope crying, Julian remaining silent, which Claire would interpret as agreement, Claire would have felt her heart clench with humiliation. She would have silently retreated to swallow her pain alone. But now, watching this performance, where one played the good cop and the other the bad cop, she felt only the absurdity of the situation. She almost wanted to laugh. She waited for Penelope to cry a little more before she spoke slowly. Her voice remained steady. "Miss Sinclair, I accept your apology, but there are a few things I think you need to understand." She took a step forward. Her clear gaze locked onto Penelope. "First, I didn't run away from home. I walked away from an unhappy marriage to start a new life. I don't need anyone's permission for that, and it's not a tantrum. Second," her gaze drifted to Julian with a hint of irony, "the fact that Mr. Vance isn't eating, isn't sleeping, and dropped his work, that's his business. It was his choice to come here. Those are his emotions and problems to deal with. Adults are responsible for their own actions." I am not obligated to manage his emotional state, and I certainly won't change my decision because of it. Penelope's sobs stopped. She stared at Claire in disbelief, unprepared for this reaction. Claire continued, her voice not loud, but perfectly clear. And third, most importantly, Miss Sinclair. The problem between Julian and me was never you or anyone else. The problem was that he didn't care about me. And during the years when I did care, he never learned to value it. The disappointment built up drop by drop. My heart grew cold day by day. That night at the airport was just the final straw. If it hadn't been your phone call, it would have been something else that made me realize the truth and leave. So please, don't give yourself so much credit. And you really didn't need to come all the way down here to put on this show. Your apologies mean nothing to me. They're unnecessary. These words, spoken without haste, were like a sharp scalpel cutting through all the fake kindness and manipulation, exposing the absolute core of the issue. Penelope's face flushed, then paled. She didn't know what to say and looked pleadingly at Julian. Julian's face was darker than a thundercloud, not because of Claire's harshness toward Penelope, but because of the cold detachment with which she spoke about him, as if she were excising him from her life. He didn't care. The problem was him. Realize the truth and leave. Every word whipped him, destroying his assumptions, his confusion, and even his timid hopes. Claire, he started hoarsely. Don't, Penny. Leave right now. Go back to the city. I'll handle this. Julian. Penelope didn't want to leave and stomped her foot. Get out! Julian shouted with a cold fury Penelope had never seen directed at her. She flinched, not daring to argue further. She shot Claire a look full of venom, turned on her heel, and practically ran out of the courtyard on her stilettos. The courtyard fell silent again. Julian looked at Claire. She stood tall, her gaze clear. There was no victor's triumph on her face, nor anger, only a deep, pool-like calm. And that calm terrified and drained him more than any screaming or crying ever could. I'm sorry. He swallowed hard and forced the words out. It wasn't an apology for Penelope showing up. It was for everything. For himself. Claire let out a quiet sigh. In that sigh was final liberation and even a touch of pity. Julian, I don't need your apologies anymore either. She walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and began slowly washing the clay from her hands. The sound of running water made her words stand out sharply. It ended between us the moment you drove away from the airport. You don't owe me anything. I'm not mad at you. I just don't want to live that life anymore. And I don't want a husband whose heart belongs to someone else. She turned off the tap, dried her hands, turned around, and looked at him calmly, like an old acquaintance who had become a stranger. Go back. Don't waste your time here. You have your world, your responsibilities. You're Penelope. And I am happy here, peaceful and fulfilled. This is what I wanted. Sign the papers. Let's end this with dignity. All right. Julian looked at her, at the unbending resolve and firmness in her eyes. The sun shone at her back, creating a soft golden halo around her. She stood against the backdrop of the old studio, with traces of clay on her hands, looking more like herself than ever before. She was glowing. He suddenly realized a distinct fact. He hadn't just lost an obedient wife. He had lost a woman who had once looked at him with her whole heart. He had lost a sincerity he never valued, and he had lost a potential future full of warmth and support. And now, this woman had buried the past with her own hands, and was confidently walking her own path without looking back. All his attempts to salvage it seemed pathetic and ridiculous against her conscious resolve. After a long time, Julian slowly, heavily nodded, as if it cost him all his strength. All right, he said in a voice as dry as sandpaper. I respect your choice. I'll sign the papers. Claire didn't seem surprised. She merely smiled faintly. In that smile was true relief. Thank you, she said. Then she put her apron back on, sat down at the wheel, grabbed a new lump of clay, and immersed herself in her world, never glancing at him again. Julian stood for another moment, looking at her focused profile blending with the spinning clay, and then silently, step by step, walked out of the courtyard full of the smell of earth and sun. He knew that this time, he truly had to leave her life and her heart. The day Julian left Asheville, the sky was overcast. Low gray clouds hung over the mountains. The air was thick and humid, promising rain. He didn't tell Claire he was leaving, and he didn't go to the studio. He simply had Preston deliver the signed and notarized divorce papers to the B&B, along with property deeds for the penthouse and several real estate assets he thought might interest her. He knew she wouldn't accept them, but he prepared them anyway. Betty handed Claire the envelope with a complicated expression. She wanted to say something, but only sighed. "Claire, sweetie, that Julian guy left this morning. Sat outside our porch for a long time before he went." Claire took the lightweight folder, thanked her, her expression unchanging. Returning to her room, she opened it. First, she took out the divorce petition. On the line for the husband's signature, it read Julian Vance. The handwriting was still firm, but the final stroke seemed a bit unsteady. She turned the page, confirmed everything was in order, took a pen, and confidently signed her name next to his, Claire Elizabeth Sterling. A 3-year marriage that started casually had ended with 2 signatures on paper, clean and final. She didn't even read the property deeds. She put them back in the folder and handed them to Betty. "Betty, could you please send these back to this return address? Cash on delivery." Having dealt with the final piece of business, Claire felt the last thin thread tying her to the past snap. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of rain and clay. She wasn't sad. On the contrary, she felt light, as if she had been reborn. She kept one copy of the decree, mailed the other to Julian's lawyers, then changed into her work clothes and headed back to the studio. Life went on. Her lessons, her new pieces, that was where she needed to direct all her energy now. Life flowed like the river in the historic town, calmly and steadily. Claire fully immersed herself in the world of ceramics. Under Arthur's guidance, her skill grew visibly. From lopsided practice pieces, she moved to creating balanced, harmonious bowls, vases, and pitchers. She began experimenting with simple glazes, bamboo shoots, willow leaves, a few brushstrokes depicting distant mountains. Arthur told her that her designs had air and soul. But most importantly, she found a long-forgotten peace and a sense of belonging here. She became friends with the owners of the diner, and now they always gave her an extra scoop of chili. She met the retired man who ran the bluegrass circle at the community center, and sometimes went to listen to him play the banjo. And Betty became like family, reminding her to wear a sweater, and always saving her a slice of pie. She was no longer an accessory, Vance's wife. She was just Claire Sterling, a quiet but determined young woman from the city who was learning to make pottery. 3 months later, Asheville hosted its annual Appalachian Arts and Crafts Festival. Arthur advised Claire to exhibit a few of her best pieces in the emerging artist's tent. Not to win prizes, but to see people, talk, broaden your horizons, he said. Claire was hesitant, but she gave in. She chose 3 pieces: a simple, wide-brimmed bowl covered in a slate blue glaze, a small vase with carved bamboo details, and her favorite, a rustic teacup with a speckled glaze that resembled partridge feathers. It had been difficult to make, but the result was incredibly warm and authentic. On the day of the festival, the town was packed with tourists. Claire's booth was in an inconspicuous corner, but she had decorated it beautifully, draping the table in indigo linen. She didn't expect much attention, but her works, with their simple forms, warm colors, and restrained charm, attracted collectors. An older, distinguished gentleman stood at her table for a long time, admiring the teacup. "There is pedigree in your work, nothing gaudy," he said, and bought it for a handsome price. As he left, he handed her his card. He was the vice president of the state's Artisan Guild. Claire was thrilled. For the first time, something she had created with her own hands and heart had been recognized and valued. It was a feeling no jewelry or designer bags could ever provide. As she was carefully putting the money away, a familiar voice sounded nearby. "Claire, is that really you? Did you make all this?" Claire looked up and saw Ethan, a friend from her college design program. Ethan was 2 years ahead of her, studying sculpture, but had always been interested in practical crafts. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I came for the guild conference." He pointed toward the main pavilion and looked back at her work. "Wow, Sterling. Long time no see, and you're already a master. The colors, the forms." "I'm just learning from a local master," Claire said, blushing slightly. "Don't be modest. I heard you had some life changes. So you live and study here now?" Claire nodded confidently. Yes, I like it here. Ethan looked at her. In her simple linen clothes, her hair held up by a wooden pin, with traces of clay on her hands, her eyes shone, and her smile was bright and genuine. She radiated peace and confidence. Completely unlike the girl with sad eyes who used to stand timidly next to Julian Vance. That's great, Ethan said sincerely. You look so much better than before. This is the real you. Hey, by the way, next month there's a modern craft exhibition in Chicago called New Traditions. Our guild is co-hosting it. Your work is really interesting. Do you want to participate? Claire took the flyer, hesitating. I've only been doing this for a few months. Art isn't about time. It's about feeling. About the spark. Ethan interrupted. I think you'd do great. Think about it. It's a huge opportunity. Claire looked at Ethan, then at her work, remembering the older collector's words. A fire seemed to light inside her. For the past 3 years, she had lived in isolation. She had almost forgotten that she once had dreams of being a recognized designer. All right. She lifted her head, her gaze steady, a bright smile on her lips. Thank you, Ethan, for the opportunity. I'll try. The festival ended. All 3 of Claire's pieces sold, and she even received 2 small commissions. It was the first real money she had earned from her own craft. That evening, she hosted a dinner for Arthur, Betty, and the diner owners. Everyone laughed. It was loud and warm. Arthur, having had a little bourbon, said, Claire, you have talent and grit. Stay on this path, you'll go far. And Betty, with tears in her eyes, added, I'm so happy for you, girl. A woman needs to stand on her own 2 feet. When you have a trade in your hands, your soul is at peace. Claire raised her glass of sweet tea and thanked everyone who had given her warmth and support. She knew her new life had truly begun, and it was far better than anything she could have imagined. Thousands of miles away, in his New York office, Julian Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at the city below. The divorce was finalized. He hadn't tried to contact Claire again, only occasionally getting updates from Preston that she had participated in a festival, that her work was selling well, that she had made new friends. With every piece of news, the emptiness in his soul grew larger. The woman who had once been so close to him was now living a vibrant, fulfilling life in a world he had no access to. He closed multi-million-dollar deals, but the success only brought a deeper void. He stood at the summit, but there was no one around to share the joy with, no one to come home to. Penelope had tried to restart their relationship several times, but looking at her carefully curated image, he felt only exhaustion and distaste. He had thought it was an unfinished youthful love, a dream. But when the moonlight he had considered mere background Claire completely disappeared, he realized that his youthful infatuation was laughably superficial. It couldn't fill the massive hole torn into his life. He developed insomnia, wandering the empty, cold penthouse at night. Sometimes he bought her favorite red velvet cake, watched it sit untouched, and threw it away. Some things, once lost, can never be recovered. Some people, once let go, are lost forever. Eventually, he locked the divorce decree and the returned property deeds in the furthest corner of his safe and gave Preston one final order. You no longer need to report to me on Claire Sterling, unless she contacts us herself, or there's an absolute emergency. Yes, Mr. Vance. Julian looked out into the dark night. The city glittered with lights, but not a single one burned for him anymore. In the end, for his pride and indifference, he had paid the highest and most bitter price of his life. 3 years later, Chicago Arts District. The New Traditions exhibition for modern artisans was in full swing. The booth for Claire Sterling and her studio, Sterling Ceramics, was located in a bright corner. Instead of a modest folding table like in Asheville 3 years ago, it was now a stylish space designed with raw wood and linen. Her work had become more mature and confident. Simple, elegant forms, calm, earthy glazes. Special attention was drawn to a tea set titled Seasons in the Woods, which captured the mood of each time of year perfectly. Claire, wearing a long navy tunic and loose trousers, her hair secured with a wooden pin, was quietly explaining the firing process of a specific bowl to a visitor. Her voice was calm, her gaze focused, and every movement exuded the confidence earned over time. Claire, there is so much peace in your work, the visitor, an elegant, middle-aged woman, said admiringly. Thank you. I just believe that an object should serve a person and bring them harmony, Claire smiled. After seeing the guest off, she turned to pour herself some water. Her eyes accidentally met the gaze of a man who had just walked into the hall. For a second, time froze. Julian. In a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, still as sharp as ever. But the cold edge in his eyes was gone, replaced by a restrained, almost weary depth. He seemed to have just arrived and, while listening to his assistant, casually scanned the room. His eyes found her perfectly. Across the crowd, across 3 years of time, their eyes met. Claire clearly saw Julian's pupils dilate for a fraction of a second. Shock, confusion, and a complex mix of emotions flashed across his face, but quickly settled into a deep, quiet expression. He didn't look away, but he didn't approach either. He just stood and watched, as if verifying if she were real, reassessing her from a distance. Claire's heart fluttered for a second, like the surface of a pond touched by a breeze, but the ripple faded. She didn't avoid his gaze, but she didn't show surprise either. She simply gave a slight, polite, and detached nod like acknowledging an old, distant acquaintance, and then naturally looked away to greet another visitor. Her profile was soft, a professional smile on her lips. She was completely absorbed in her conversation. Julian stood rooted to the spot. Preston was saying something about the exhibition layout, but Julian didn't hear a word. All his attention was locked onto that figure in the navy tunic, bathed in soft light. He had imagined their meeting thousands of times, but he never thought it would happen here, in an environment that suited her so perfectly. She had changed, and not just outwardly. She radiated the confidence of someone who had found her place. She was no longer an accessory to anyone. She was the master of her own world. Preston, noticing his gaze, said quietly, "Mr. Vance, that's Claire Sterling, founder of Sterling Ceramics, one of the most sought-after young artists at this exhibition. Her pieces are highly valued by collectors right now. Should we go over?" Julian swallowed hard and replied barely above a whisper, "Yes." He didn't approach immediately. First, he walked past several other booths, pretending to look at the art, but slowly making his way to her corner. Claire felt his approach but remained unbothered. Over 3 years, the storm had settled into a calm sea. Now she had her passion, her own studio, loyal friends. Ethan had become her business partner. Julian was a turned page. Finally, when Claire had a free moment, Julian stepped up to her booth. "Long time no see," he began. His voice was lower and raspier than she remembered. "It has been a long time." "Hello, Mr. Vance," Claire smiled. Flawlessly polite, like speaking to a client. "Unexpected to see you here. Are you visiting the exhibition?" The address, Mr. Vance, clearly drew the boundary. Julian felt a sharp prick in his chest. He nodded. His eyes fell on her work. "Yes. Friends recommended it. Did you make all of this?" "A few of my humble attempts," she gestured toward the season's tea set. "This is a recent experiment." Julian looked closely. He didn't know much about ceramics, but he had taste. He could see these pieces were special, simple, but strong, exactly like she was now. "They're beautiful," he said sincerely, shifting his gaze from the pottery to her face. "And they suit you perfectly." "Thank you." She accepted the compliment calmly. After the brief exchange of pleasantries, the conversation seemed to dry up. Former spouses, separated by 3 years and entirely different lives, had nothing left to talk about. Julian paused, then suddenly asked, "Is this tea set for sale?" Claire was slightly surprised, but answered professionally, "The display pieces aren't for sale. You can place a commission through our website after the exhibition, but right now, there's a 6-month wait list." 6 months? Julian repeated quietly. He looked up, meeting her eyes with a serious expression. "I can wait. I really like this set. I'd like to commission one." He paused, then added, "Also, I'm currently working on developing a luxury wellness resort property. We need unique artisan pieces for the interiors. Does your studio take corporate contracts?" He said your studio, not you. He was putting them on equal commercial footing. Claire thought for a moment. Partnering with Vance Corporation would undoubtedly be massive for her brand. This was purely business. "Thank you for your interest, Mr. Vance," she said, using an even more formal tone. For wholesale and corporate inquiries, you can speak with my commercial director, Ethan Brooks. Here is his card. She handed him an elegant business card. Ethan Brooks. Julian took it. His eyes lingered on the name for a second. He remembered that guy, the one from the festival in Asheville. Now he was her partner. Something twisted in his chest, but he didn't show it. Understood. My office will contact Mr. Brooks. Clear boundaries. Professional tone. Exactly what Claire wanted. I won't keep you any longer. You have a lot of guests, Julian said, stepping back. I wish you a successful exhibition, Claire. Thank you. Take care, Mr. Vance. Julian took one last, long look at her, as if trying to permanently burn her new image into his memory. Independent, confident, glowing. Then he turned and walked toward the exit.